Hey everybody, welcome back to this week's Green Eggs and BAM. It's our series of thought-provoking sustainability discussions with thought leaders like Dr. Erin Meyer with the Seattle Aquarium. We explore how to create the new next normal, one that is just, resilient, and thriving. And we do this because we don't have the answers. So we're engaging people like Dr. Meyer in this exploration of how do we do this? How do we create a just, resilient, and thriving new next normal? I'm Daniel Lossie, Chief Century Thinker at Verdis Group, where we help organizations across the country become more thriving and resilient by using sustainability as a strategy. And for this episode of Green Eggs and BAM, I'm joined by Dr. Erin Meyer, the Director of Conservation Programs and Partnerships, very important that the partnerships are in there, at the Seattle Aquarium, where she builds these partnerships and advances co-generated, innovative, and enduring solutions for oceans. Welcome. How are you, Erin?
Thank you, Daniel. Doing well today. It's a typical, normal, cloudy, yet beautiful day in Seattle.
And you were just telling me the temperature is what, like in the 60s?
In the 60s, which is glorious.
And I'm sitting here in Omaha, Nebraska in humid 80-degree weather. So if I start sweating, just send me some of that cool Seattle air.
Will do.
Well, I'm super excited you're joining us today. I'm super pumped because I love the way that you find connections between things. You have your degree in integral biology, which is just fascinating. I wish I would have known that field existed. And I love your systems thinking approach to things, and that's why we want to talk to you. We want to ask you some questions about sustainability and the pandemic and what intersections you're seeing, if any, and what that means for us. So, do a little introduction of yourself and one highlight for what you love about being at the Seattle Aquarium, and then start to connect the dots for us between COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, if you see any. What's changed? What hasn't?
Oh, wow. Gosh. So thanks, Daniel. So as you said, so I'm Dr. Meyer. I work at the Seattle Aquarium. I've been there for just over 2 years now, and it was a new position when I started there. And it's been a really awesome 2.5 years or so that I've been working with them, really charged with building out some new conservation programs, both here in Washington State, but also internationally focused within the Coral Triangle region. And also really truly building a public policy and advocacy program for the aquarium. And that's been, I think, one of the biggest joys and successes that I have to look at in just the 2.5 years that I've been there is just the incredible expansion of that area of our work. It's been really, really fun and awesome, truly awesome to see the results of all of that work. Connecting the dots. So yes, there are many dots to connect. I think together with the climate crisis, I really see that there have been several other crises, of course, that predated the COVID-19 pandemic, including the health crisis and the education crisis. And there are some things kind of setting the stage for that for us. For example, about 9.5% of Americans right now don't have health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. And this percentage actually nearly doubles or even triples if we're pulling the numbers for non-Hispanic Black people or Hispanic people. So there's truly a health crisis in the country too. There's also, consider for a moment, how school district lines are drawn. In much of the US, these fall on municipal lines, which reflect years of residential segregation. And this is a direct impact on school funding, the quality of education, and what our children are walking away from their education learning. And all three of these, the health crisis, the education crisis, the climate crisis, all disproportionately impact Blacks, Indigenous peoples, Latinos, and others who are and have been targeted by systemic racism. One of your, actually, I think your very first BAM episode with Dr. Khan, he also mentioned that these crises and mentioned that they're rooted in this kind of anti-science and in anti-scientist and outright denial of facts. And that's also a huge problem that interestingly links across these crises. The climate crisis in particular, it's not just about tree huggers and coral lovers and I'm both, but it affects each and every one of us. Like COVID-19, warming temperatures, increased storms, sea level rise. These climate impacts, they don't discern what your political affiliation is. They don't discern whether or not you accept the fact that the climate has changed and is continuing to change. You're going to be equally impacted by these things, no matter what it is that you believe or accept. You know, and anyone around the climate crisis, people who are still questioning whether or not that's real. You know, I heard recently, you know, the president of the Marshall Islands speak about her work to develop a climate adaptation plan and how she's also weighing the need to evacuate her entire country to another country on higher ground, you know. And the final thing I want to say around this is that COVID-19 is shining a really big spotlight on the systemic racism that's driving inequalities in access to affordable health care, to well-funded schools, and on the disproportionate impacts of climate change. You know, those with underlying respiratory or vascular conditions are at higher risk of a severe case of COVID-19. And these human health conditions are often caused by chronically poor environmental conditions. And those poor environmental conditions are caused in part by carbon emitting vehicles, by industrial development, and by, you know, the irresponsible industries that are finding loopholes in our environmental legislation. And these types of industries are often cited or placed within communities of color. So in short, all of these crises are linked: education, health, climate, COVID-19, and, you know, all of them are exacerbated by the systemic racism and also ignoring or outright denying science.
I knew you would have a great answer to that because of the way that you see all the connections and this integrative world that we live in, that when you do, you can't pull anything out without finding it attached to everything else. A nod to John Muir's quote. So as it relates to our response to the pandemic, I'm wondering what lessons we're learning that you think could be applied to the climate crisis and climate action. Are you seeing anything we're doing today really well that we can actually use in our climate action, climate response?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, actually. And I would say about 3 lessons, maybe not necessarily things that we're doing well, but things that we're learning through what we're going through right now. So the first, so for the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, society has a very simple choice. We've kind of been through it now for 5 months. You know, that choice is to put on a mask and protect yourself and others while you're walking around, or don't, and help spread that disease around in your local communities and within your family. And there are a myriad of other small shifts that we can each make to be a part of the solution and to help get to the other side of this pandemic more quickly. So, you know, in other words, small actions and small changes can shift the trajectory of the spread. And it's exactly the same with the climate crisis. You know, to change the future, you know, we must each make some small personal changes in our lives, like taking public transit or biking, if you don't already. But I want to tie this back to what I mentioned around systemic racism, because those who are experiencing racism in this country may also impact somebody's ability to make those small changes in their lives. You know, restricting essential travel is easy for those of us who are not essential workers, or for those of us whose companies have shifted to working online, for example. But essential workers have to put themselves out there and are at risk every day. So there's inequalities wrapped around that. And those of us who are in a place of privilege who can make those changes really need to make the commitment to do so. The second thing that I would say that the pandemic has taught us, which is strange that it took a pandemic for us to realize this, but that we really need leaders who are willing to make decisive, really bold actions that are focused on protecting their people. And those actions and those bold decisions are often the less popular choice, right? So wearing a mask, mandating mask wearing versus not. Investing in long-term solutions that focus on the communities who need those investments most, or investing in natural climate solutions around coastal restoration, versus investing in industries that can produce results in the span of a political term. So we've gotten to this place where we're really politicizing saving lives, and we need to get beyond that. And let me be clear that all of the crises that I'm talking about, education, healthcare, climate, COVID-19, they're all about saving lives. It's not just healthcare and COVID-19. Education and the climate crisis also impact our lives. And then the third one that's rising up for me ties back to something that I said a little bit earlier, but that we need to really increase science literacy in this country, and to get back to a place where scientists and our data are respected. You know, scientists, we don't hope for bad things. We don't hope that our data are going to demonstrate that the climate is changing faster than animals and plants have a chance to adapt, but that's what the data say. We don't hope that the data are showing that species are going extinct at a rate on par with the past mass extinction events, but that's what the data are telling us. You know, on the contrary, I mean, we search for hope, and we hope for hope for the glimmers of promising solutions to arguably the greatest challenge, honestly, that our species as humans have ever faced, this climate crisis. You know, so the pandemic has taught us that making small personal sacrifices or changes in our lives can have incredible impacts on human health and the health of our planet, that bold, forward-thinking, long-term thinking decisions by our leaders can save lives, both in the short term and in the long term, and that science in all of its forms, so inclusive of traditional, indigenous, fishermen's, and local knowledge, should really be what's guiding how we make those decisions and what kind of path forward we're preparing for ourselves.
I love that. The piece about long-term thinking. I mean, my title is Chief Century Thinker because it helps me remember that decisions we're making today need to be thought about in centuries, not political terms. And the idea that you said we need bold, decisive leadership oftentimes is not popular in the present moment, but in retrospect, when you take that long-term view, you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that worked. Lincoln, Nebraska passed a mask mandate 3 or 4 weeks before City of Omaha. And their curve has bent down pretty significantly and pretty quickly. And Omaha delayed for various reasons. And we now have one. And our curve is starting to bend down. But at the time, it wasn't popular in Lincoln. It wasn't popular in Omaha. And it's just really fascinating to watch how hard it is as a leader to balance both the immediate needs and the people who you are committed to serve. And they don't always have all the information, but they also have a very important voice and need to be listened to with the long-term thinking and that courageous leadership that's required. So you mentioned, you mentioned some of the solutions. I'm wondering if you could share just 1 or 2 opportunities or solutions for co-creating a next normal that's just, that's resilient and thriving. Like, what should we be exploring? And if you want to add something else too, go for it.
Yeah, so, you know, I think, gosh, we have this incredible opportunity right now. You know, our whole world, our industries here in the United States, our communities, everybody's upended right now. And, you know, we will eventually fully pivot over from, you know, what is right now feeling like, oh, we need relief from this pandemic, we need relief. We'll eventually fully pivot to stimulus, to rebuilding. And, you know, we need to recognize, and I feel like a lot of folks are recognizing, that we don't want to get back to where we were before. That's not good enough. We need to get beyond where we were before. And so when we get, specifically around like economic recovery, when we get to the point that we're starting to think about, you know, economic recovery investments, you know, we really need to push Congress and our local governments to invest in green and blue infrastructure projects that not only are going to stimulate the economy and create jobs, because they'll totally do that, but they'll also result in more climate resilient communities. So this is that kind of marriage of this, you know, short-term need around recovering the economy, creating jobs, you know, getting people back to work, while also recognizing that you can do those investments in a way that's going to result in long-term resilience and long-term recovery back into those communities. And, you know, when I think about coastal restoration as a part of that, you know, we can make the decisions, we can push our elected leaders to make decisions about investing, you know, recovery dollars into the communities that are most impacted by climate change, most impacted by COVID-19, most impacted by, you know, other existing threats to people's livelihoods, and also target those dollars to, you know, natural recovery solutions that will set us up in a way that we're, again, creating more climate resilient long-term communities, because coastal ecosystems like seagrass beds and tidal wetlands and others, they actually sequester up to 4 times more carbon than doing similar kinds of restoration on land. So if you want to talk about how to bring all those things together, if you do that in coastal restoration and place it in the communities, on indigenous lands and waters and the communities that are most impacted, you're going to get the most out the other side in climate resilient communities, both human communities and ocean communities.
And that requires paying attention to the science and looking at the data. And I know Project Drawdown is a great resource for well-vetted, well-researched solutions that we have today, like what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, we all have to remember, like, our elected officials, they work for us. We pay their salaries, regardless of whether or not you align on all the issues. So I feel like this is my call to action. I probably have more of them later, but if everyone who's watching this emails and calls their elected officials, local, state, and federal regularly about the issues that they care about most, about making sure we're moving toward that just co-created, new future for the country, and whatever that means for you, they have to listen to you because they're your staff. They work for you, and so we all need to take advantage of the fact that that they work for us and make that phone call, send those emails. It's really easy to do.
Well, and you beat me to my final question, which is what's the call to action? Because we are out of time. And the call to action from Dr. Erin Meyer is raise your voice. Let people know that these are important things and that investments in the right places can not only help us in the short term with jobs and equity, but it can help us in the long term to create a world where people, animals, plants can all thrive together in a healthy, whole, integral way.
Yeah, we have to build back better, and we do that by not just changing the what and the how, which we've talked a little bit about, but we also have to change the who. And that's what ties us back to, the systemic racism, the voices and the people who haven't been brought to the table and a part of those conversations. And, that's bringing the who and broadening the who that are involved in shaping the what and how is what's going to truly get us to that just co-created new future.
Right. It takes all of us. And I think we have to be able to imagine what's possible before we can create it. And when we have all the people at the table, we can imagine what is possible and build back better. Erin, thank you so much for taking time today to share your insights and your systems thinking and integral biology. I love it. Love the connections that you drew and breaking it down into simple things, simple lessons from it's about choices, it's about bold, decisive action and increasing science literacy. All of this is helping us and all of you who are viewing today think about, imagine, and begin to create a new next normal that's resilient, just, and thriving. I believe you received some Artemis tea because part of our Green Eggs and BAM is to share locally produced tea and coffee with people. So drinking some cicada from Artemis Teas. And I want to thank you for joining us, everybody who's viewing, and join us next week for another episode of Green Eggs and BAM as we engage thought-provoking sustainability discussions with thought leaders from across the country. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Daniel.